Schools, students and teachers have always been a rich source of material for television shows like Please Sir, Grange Hill and Derry Girls. There is an easily recognised dynamic of us versus them, children versus teachers, and it's not always the teachers on the winning side. So it comes as no surprise that some of these school-based sitcoms will end up being judged as controversial in some way. These are the most controversial school-related sitcoms from 3 different types of school in 3 time periods. 2 of these sitcoms lasted a number of years, but one had its first series cancelled after only 2 episodes had been broadcast. The first series we're going to look at dates back to the early days of television, so this might not be familiar to a lot of people. It's also a type of school that only a select part of the population will ever have attended. Wacko was broadcast on BBC television for 7 series from 1956 to 1960, followed by one revival series in 1972. It was written by Dennis Norden and Frank Muir. It starred Jimmy Edwards, who played Professor James Edwards, the head teacher at Chiselbury School, a public school described in the opening titles as being for the sons of gentlefolk. Edwards had previously performed as the professor character in various BBC variety shows, so the show was developed for him. The school was rather run down and the pupils were just as likely to leave and end up in Pentonville prison rather than a city job commensurate with their parents' expectations. This was because Professor Edwards was a devious gambler who tyrannised the children as he tried to swindle them out of their pocket money to finance his schemes. His bullying tactics were not confined simply to his students. Members of his staff were given a particularly rough ride, especially his weedy right-hand man, Mr. Pettigrew, played by Arthur Howard. As his eagerness to feather his own nest with school funds escalated, the show started to resemble Sergeant Bilko's exploits in The Phil Silvers Show, first shown in the UK in 1957, but that isn't what made it controversial. We have to look back at the title of the show, Wacko. As well as being a serial swindler of pupils and parents, the Edwards character was a cane-swishing drunk. Almost every image relating to the show featured Edwards flexing or swishing a cane. Of course, in those days, canes were widely used for corporal punishment, probably even more widely in public schools. Corporal punishment as a source of humour didn't offend anybody in the 1950s and was commonplace in children's comics like The Beano. It's one thing having violence portrayed against a child in a comic, clearly intended for humorous effect, but seeing it enacted by real people, albeit acting and not actually hurting anyone, lacks any moral substance. The comedy of the plots was constructed around whether the boys would be caught and punished for minor misdemeanours and the size and effectiveness of the canes used. The Edwards character's persistent boozing was also considered good fun, often starting the day with beer poured from a teapot. In another favourite scenario, Edwards would say, "I must gain myself some refreshment from the arts," reaching for a volume of Shakespeare hollowed out with a bottle of whisky hidden inside. This, of course, helped disguise the fact that Edwards was often inebriated when performing. In 1961, it was not one of the fictional students that ended up in prison, but one of the grown-up actors. Arthur Howard, whose role was Edwards' ineffectual assistant Oliver Pettigrew, was arrested in Brighton for importuning in Jenks Public's toilets. To avoid any graphic explanation, it is similar to the incident where George Michael was arrested in a public toilet in Beverly Hills, California in April 1998. Howard was fined £25 and imprisoned for 1 week. George Michael was fined £500 and ordered to carry out 80 hours of community service. Allowing for inflation, Michael's fine was double that of Howard's. So Howard, although named in Radio Times, was of course unable to appear in the show whilst he was in prison. The scandal clearly worried the BBC and consequently Howard did not return to Wacko. The show continued with Roddy Maud-Roxby taking over the part of Mr. Pettigrew. Although he was married, Edwards was exposed as homosexual in 1979. In an attempt to deflect negative publicity after Edwards divorced, press reports spoke of his engagement to actress, singer and comedian Joan Turner. It was typical for performers to disguise their sexuality due to the illegality of such relationships in the 1960s and the prevailing public attitude to such associations. Anthony Slide, who wrote a biography of Edwards, Wake Up at the Back There, It's Jimmy Edwards, in 2018, said, "I cannot find it anything but fascinating and decidedly weird that two gay men were starring in a BBC series involving the use of a cane on the bottoms of young boys." A total of 60 episodes of Wacko were broadcast over 8 series. The first few series were broadcast live, so no recordings exist, and only about 16 other episodes survive in the BBC archive. BBC Radio adapted the television scripts into 45 30-minute shows, mostly with the original cast, of which 42 recordings survive. There were 3 series which originally ran on the BBC Light programme from May 1961 until July 1963. There was a film version in 1959 titled Bottoms Up, which is available on DVD. From a 1950s public school to our second scholastic establishment, the adult education classes in a London college with a group of students learning English as a foreign language. Mind Your Language was made by London Weekend Television for ITV and ran for 3 series between 1977 and 1979. It was briefly revived in 1986 with 6 of the original cast members. Michael Grade, director of programmes at London Weekend Television, commissioned the series after being inspired by the 1937 book The Education of Hyman Kaplan by Leah Ruston. It was set in a New York night class for English learners. Among the characters, in addition to Mr. Kaplan and the teacher, are an old Russian woman, a Greek man and a loud Italian man. Mind Your Language was written by Vince Powell and starred Barry Evans as teacher Mr. Jeremy Brown, who had been mostly out of work since he left Doctor at Large in 1971. Over the 4 series, a total of 21 actors played a variety of foreign students. It was promoted by the TV Times as the new multiracial comedy series, and it could have been a genuine effort to present characters from various different countries in a subtle blend of comedy and camaraderie. However, the comedy firmly fixated on misunderstandings of English language and customs and the relentless exploitation of obvious national stereotypes. It was heavy on smutty innuendo, with several overtly pretty and scantily clad female students. Some of them were very keen for extra tuition from Mr. Brown. There was obvious xenophobia between certain demographics. The Sikh and Pakistani Muslim characters regularly insulted each other. Using this series as an example, Sarita Malik, in Representing Black Britain, wrote that blacks, Asians or race were usually the butt of the joke, which tended to hit a racist note, but always in a well-meaning, benevolent tone. She continued that never before had so many diverse races been seen in the same television frame, but they had never clung so tightly to their popular, crude national stereotypes. At the time, head of comedy at London Weekend Television, Humphrey Barclay, defended the programme on the grounds that seeing different races on screen would familiarise and naturalise them to a white majority viewing public. The series was considered as a fair portrayal of Indians at that time and garnered a positive reception from Asian families. Most liked it because it was one of the few representations of Asian people on television at the time. Neil Biswas wrote in the Guardian Extra in September 2003, "When I think back and wonder why my parents enjoyed it so much, I can only come up with one answer. They recognised themselves in Mind Your Language. For them, it was a representation of their own situation. For me, it's my earliest memory of seeing Asian people on TV." It is true that Mind Your Language was hugely popular with the viewing public, peaking at 18 million viewers, but it was simply reinforcing ideologies without any multicultural awareness. In 1985, Michael Grade agreed that Mind Your Language was racist and said it was really irresponsible of us to put it out. More recent analysis of opinion would agree that it was a miscalculation. In 2004, the independent newspaper asked some media personalities their impressions of the series. Television presenter and newspaper publisher Andrew Neil said it was racist, xenophobic and extremely unfunny. Stan Hay, screenwriter of Agvidas en Pet and Agony, commented, "Mind Your Language was awful. It was set in a language school and played every foreign stereotype to the full. It was just racist." Writer and comedian Paul Merton said, "Mind Your Language was dodgy, stereotypical stuff." Actor Linda Robson from Birds of a Feather said, "Mind Your Language was stupid and ridiculous because of its stereotyping. It was generally pretty awful. It seems really old-fashioned now, but even then it wasn't funny at all." Despite everything that was negative about it, the series was sold to 12 other countries, including Pakistan, India and Nigeria. It was also one of the first British television programmes to be shown in South Africa after the end of the boycott by the British Actors Equity Association. It was also broadcast in Canada from 1978 to 1982 and by some independent broadcasting company stations in the United States during 1985. Then there were international remakes in 12 countries, sometimes in English and the local language, including Japan, Malaysia and South Korea. Bridge TV, an American Muslim cable channel, broadcast the show in 2005, claiming that Mind Your Language could be a positive force for multiculturalism, despite the Sikh and Pakistani students frequently being portrayed as on the brink of war with one another. So apparently it wasn't all bad. The revival series in 1986 was Barry Evans' final television appearance. He had just one further acting role in the film The Mystery of Edwin Drood in 1993. In 1997 he was found dead in his flat, aged 53. The cause of his death has never been confirmed. Finally, we visit a 1980s comprehensive school for pupils over 11 years of age. This type of school took over from the secondary modern schools of the 1970s, where children of different perceived abilities were sent to different types of secondary school. The comprehensive system took all ability levels. However, in the central television production of Hardwick House, it looks like a majority of the pupils are from the lower ability category. ITV clearly expected the series to be a big success, with some very well-known British character comedy actors and heavy publicity in the TV Times. Hardwick House was written by Richard Hall and Simon Wright, who had both had teaching experience but not much television comedy writing experience. Their lack of experience should not have been a defining factor in the success or otherwise of the production. Central Television clearly liked whatever preliminary outline or scripts they had seen, and they were always at liberty, as they were paying the bills, to engage additional writers or a script editor. They didn't, and it shows. Not that the script was what made it particularly controversial. Most of it was shaky, but some of it was reasonably competent. The children were very nearly believable, mostly just a bit over the top. However, in the first episode broadcast, the South African ambassador and his wife are taking their child to the school. In addition to their forced South African accents, their attempts to self-correct long-standing racially insensitive terms for the indigenous people of their home country are painful to listen to. The script was trying to combine traditional comedy material with the edgy values of alternative comedy. Think of Terry and June Meet the Young Ones. They even had the cheek to recycle a well-known comedy trope in the form of a phone conversation where we only hear one side and the person is trying to console the caller who has apparently been bullied at school and does not want to attend, only for it to be revealed that they're a teacher. Roy Kinnear was the headmaster of this crumbling and low-achieving school. He did his best with the script and was a professional in the part, as one would expect. It's a shame he was underused. More of his solid comedy character acting could have given the show a bit of the boost it needed. Another comedy stalwart, Roger Sloman, played his deputy, who appeared to have an unhealthy interest in the boys. This went unchallenged but was not developed upon beyond the first episode. Head of English was performed by Granville Saxton. He had the look of actor and satirist Peter Cook playing the child catcher from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but sadly over-egged his performance. His detestation of the pupils felt very theatrical. Another actor given a role that was way below his skills was Duncan Preston as the Icelandic exchange teacher abandoned by his native school for unknown but apparently dishonourable reasons. He did his best with an attempt at what might sound like an Icelandic accent. Perhaps this could have been handled differently. He was a one-note character, loud, foreign and stupid. Pam Ferris was landed with the unenviable task of having the part of the only female teacher, and was also given the stereotype feminist but not a lesbian even though everyone says she looks like one role. This also meant that instead of teaching French at the drop of a misgendered noun, she would instruct her class to start making placards and then mount a demonstration in the playground supporting her latest cause celeb. Tony Haygarth was the aggressive, illiterate monosyllabic sports teacher, often prone to grunting in response to headmaster, requiring translation by another teacher. Sadly, the role was terribly written and Tony deserved better. The series was made with video cameras in a real comprehensive school building. Film was norm for location work at the time. There were signs that the building had deteriorated a bit, and these were capitalised on by the liberal application of graffiti outside and inside the building. This made for a degree of realism not usually seen in studio sitcoms, but it was not without its problems. Being made on video has resulted in an even grittier look to the series, which I assume was accidental, but it did suit the visual aesthetic. This also worked against the show, making it on 16 or 32mm film would have given a much clearer image that could have been manipulated at the editing stage if necessary. Instead of which, everything has the same fuzzy video look. A disadvantage of filming on location was that, in the first episode in particular, the sound quality was terrible. Reverberations from sound bouncing off the solid walls was very prevalent. This is not an issue in a studio, where this is mitigated by set and studio design. Fortunately, it was mostly resolved for the second episode. Central Television bosses, however, must have been happy with the show, because even before anything was broadcast, a second series was commissioned and work started, but they were all in for a bit of a rude awakening. A total of 7 episodes of Series 1 were made. The first was an hour-long episode broadcast on the 24th of February 1987 at 8 p.m, followed by a regular 30-minute episode on the 25th of February 1987 at 8:30. The first episode broadcast felt like a pilot, although this is not acknowledged in any documentation available. My main reason for suspecting this is the extended programme length and that it felt like it was the first day of a new term. But the second episode was titled The First Day of Term. Also, some of the technical issues in the first episode, particularly the sound quality, had improved in the second episode. A pilot would have been recorded as a standalone project, but subsequent episodes would most likely have recorded all scenes in a particular location at the same time, so would effectively have the opportunity to fine-tune things like the technical issues. Episode 3 was scheduled to be broadcast on the 4th of March 1987. The Radio Times for that week had already been printed, but it was not shown, nor were any of the remaining episodes. This means an episode guest starring Adrian Edmondson and Rick Mayall, who at that time were at the height of their fame with The Young Ones, never saw the light of day. Don't worry, you haven't missed anything. They couldn't save the terrible script. But a dodgy script and some racist language did not amount to anything particularly controversial, except that is not what the viewing public were expecting to be broadcast before the watershed in what was typically the time slot for more conventional sitcom fare like Fresh Fields. The managing director of Central Television, Andy Allen, conceded that it had not gone down well with viewers. So, while cancelling the remainder of this scheduled broadcasts, consideration was given to eventually air the series in a late night slot. Perhaps that would have been the better option anyway. Sticking it on at 10 p.m. on a Sunday would have looked very tame considering other shows broadcast in that slot. Less likely was the suggestion that the show was deliberately aired in an unsuitable time slot so that Central could say it was so unpopular and ditch it. Considering work had already started on a second series, that scenario is unlikely. Despite suggestions it was later broadcast in a late night slot or even on Channel 4, there's no documentation to support this idea. So what caused the overwhelming barrage of outrage from viewers and tabloid newspapers alike? Some criticisms were that it was just not very good, but other viewers focused on the implied unhealthy relationships between the staff and pupils, as well as the anarchic behaviour of the children that was believed by some to be a political comment on the state of education at the time. To be fair, the English teacher did electrocute one pupil, the head girl did wear revealing outfits, and the school bully did, albeit absent-mindedly, drop another pupil down the stairwell. Press reports accurately reflected and amplified public reaction to the show. However, it was clear that some of the journalists had not seen the show themselves, as their articles confused various characters and their attributes. Many subsequent reviewers evidently did not watch the show either and repeated erroneous comments from earlier press reports. The Kent Evening Post reported, "I suggest Hardwick House, ITV Wednesday, should be pulled down. There is no other use for this atrocious new series. What actor Roy Kinnear is doing in it as a bumbling headmaster defeats me." Manchester Evening News. On the strength of the first two episodes of Hardwick House, the new ITV sitcom blurs the distinction between poor and puerile. I can only hope the ex-teachers who wrote it weren't teaching anything important. Birmingham News. Hardwick House is a new manic comedy series which seems to have been screened at the wrong time of night. Nottingham Evening Post. Central TV has pulled its controversial black comedy series Hardwick House off the air after just 2 episodes because of complaints from viewers. The Daily Mirror simultaneously praised and criticised the programme in 2 separate articles. On the 28th of February 1987 it quoted a source saying, "The series is a reflection of inner city comprehensives today. The kids in the show are very lifelike and the staff are actually amalgams of teachers." While in another article it said, "A detention for the Central TV twit who decided we needed a dreadful dragged out hour then another half hour of Hardwick House, the school's farce this week." One wonders what public reaction would have been to the events of the final episode, titled Passion Play, that was due to broadcast a couple of weeks before Easter in 1987, in which a vicar gets hit by a falling cross at the school's Easter service, and the staff decide to cover up the incident. Like many controversies, the commotion soon died down and the show was forgotten about by all but the most enthusiastic fans of television comedy. It was suggested that the Independent Broadcasting Authority had ordered Central to incinerate the master tapes, but that was just hyperbole. All 7 episodes exist and are in the Central Television archive. The tapes had been located and the cast and crew clearances had been obtained for a DVD release due in about 2012. Writer and broadcaster Tim Worthington was commissioned to write a history of the show for the DVD booklet. However, because the show was untransmitted, it had to be assessed as a new programme by ITV's approval committee. They refused to sanction its release on the grounds that it was not the sort of programme that ITV would wish itself to be associated with. It is only thanks to a member of the technical crew that VHS copies of the original tapes were digitised and uploaded to YouTube in 2019, which means I've been able to watch the series, so you don't have to. It's just not funny. Well, there you have it, a brief look at some of the UK's most controversial sitcoms set in schools. It's clear that these shows pushed boundaries and sparked debate, often reflecting social issues of the time. While some people found them funny and relatable, others found them offensive and inappropriate. So, what did you think? Did these sitcoms go too far, or were they simply a reflection of the times? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more content on classic television shows. Join me again for the final episode in the series where I look at the UK's 2 most controversial sitcoms ever. Thanks for watching.